All right, good evening, Dad.
Good morning, Charlie.
Happy Friday. How are you
Yeah.
do? How are you doing?
Well, recovering from a long day at the beach yesterday. I never realized that sunbathing and floating around in the waves could be so exhausting, but
Was it pretty? Is
it
the
really
water pretty
was.
warm?
It is. It's very comfortable. Yeah, just ideal temperature. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really think about going to the beach if I go to Russia, so maybe one of these days I'll check out Sochi. Um, okay, but let's talk about some new stuff. Do we have any
Sure.
good news? I mean, I guess we got to first just address that today is the day that the
Uh,
summit meeting's happening.
right.
Anything good can come out of this at all?
Well, potentially nothing much. It's not like uh, the war is going to end as a result of this. That there's going to be a negotiated settlement. That's just not possible. Yeah, the two sides are far apart. The groundwork hasn't been laid for it. So no, don't expect anything very substantial. But just as I said, yeah, I think the best thing we can hope for is just maybe some kind of rapport between Putin and Trump that could help, again, keep us from going up the escalatory ladder in the future. Maybe, again, it's not going to stop the war, but it could prevent or help to prevent the hawks within the administration and within the establishment in general in the U.S. from pushing Trump towards, escalatory moves. I think that's the most we can hope for.
Then it sounds like it probably isn't a great idea for Putin and the Russians to do this. Do you think? If that's the best we can
Well,
hope
it's really
for?
hard to say. It's yeah, it's true. Again, Putin always said that, yeah, he was willing to meet Trump, but again, the groundwork needed to be laid, and that was always his position. And he did, reverse his position on this. He did make a concession and agreed to do this. Now we don't know what Witkoff told him in that meeting in Moscow, which was what just a little over a week ago, approximately a week ago. I can't remember exactly. Yeah, a little over a week ago. Um, we don't know what he said. So maybe there was something that he said that made Putin change his mind. We just don't know what it is. There's just been all kinds of rumors. And, maybe one of those rumors is true, but at this point, we don't know, so we can only speculate. I don't know what it was. If it seems to me that well, that there is a clear downside to this. Okay, again, he's hoping that he can speak to Trump directly. He can have his ear, without any intermediary, without anybody around them, spinning what he has to say, without somebody saying, well, this is what the Russians really want. They're saying this, but what they're really hoping for is this other thing. Maybe I think Trump probably hears a lot of that, and Putin can speak to him directly, say, no, this is what we really mean. What we've said is what we mean. Okay, these are our minimum requirements. And, the hope is that can penetrate through to Trump and have some effect on his thinking and maybe on some of his decisions down the road, even if it doesn't lead to a negotiated settlement. That's a possibility, right? But there's always a danger uh, that Trump will walk out of this angry, the way he did, after the phone call that took place. What was it on, right, like July 3rd or something? A little over a month ago. He says, I understand Trump's. You say Putin's just, he's. Um, he, Remember, he expressed quite a bit of anger and began to again describe Putin in unflattering terms, and then he went to the sanctions. And there's always a chance that could happen again. We can't say again. Trump's an unpredictable character, and who knows? He may come out of this meeting angry. I think that probably won't. Again, I'm thinking of the previous meeting they had I guess it was in Stockholm. During Trump's first term. It seemed like it went well, and I think that Trump is predisposed to like Putin, to respect him, and and again he has the reputation of always being affected by the last person that's that spoke to him. So we can see this maybe is going to happen again, and he'll come out of the meeting in a good mood and have positive things to say. Maybe in the end, nothing really will be done. Um, but at least, it won't end disastrously. I think that's the most likely outcome.
Okay, so basically we're all just saying that this is just how this affects Trump's mood, and most of it will be in the short term anyway. So maybe short term,
Right.
a better mood, but then there's a chance that if Putin says "niet" to Trump's face, then Trump gets angry. But then the thing is, like, what can an angry Trump even do? What
Right.
what is
Right.
so let's just say it does go sour. There's nothing. Does it really matter?
Yeah.
If we find out
Yeah.
this thing
Well,
blows
okay.
up and it's just a terrible
Right.
thing, and Trump hates Putin
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Well, again, Trump has actually threatened sanctions once again. He's been asked by journalists, what will you do if he doesn't accede to your demands, if he doesn't agree to a ceasefire? And he said, he threatened sanctions once again, which really, I think, means tariffs in his case. But that clearly just isn't working. And he has to know on some level that it isn't working. And I think that's actually the realization that it wasn't working is what brought him to the table. So that's a bluff on Trump's part. What can he do? Okay, well, he can keep on sending weapons, which is what they've been doing before, but that, hasn't solved anything. The Russians continue to win and to grow stronger. And the fact is, because stockpiles are depleted, that he won't even be able to send as many weapons as Biden did. There are just fewer weapons to send. So that's not going to work. I think the only thing, then there's the danger of escalation, going to the JASSM missiles, especially the extended range that could actually hit Moscow, or even worse, the Tomahawk missiles, which are nuclear capable. He's shown a resistance to doing that so far. But the danger is, there are the crazies who want to do that. And they could say, hey, this is the only leverage you've got. You want him to go to the negotiating table, he's not responding to pressure because the pressure that we've applied to him so far is insufficient. But if you go to the Tomahawk, boy, that'll bring him to the table and he'll listen to you then, Trump, and then you'll get your ceasefire. I can just see people making that kind of argument. So I think that's the one thing that he could do, which is really very, very dangerous. That would be, where you go beyond, what Biden did during his term.
When the Russian victory just becomes clearer to everybody in the West, and not only just the Russian might and the victory that's there, but just the weakness in NATO is becoming clear that even if we wanted to go in conventionally on this war, we can't win it. If that starts to get into, do you think it's breaking into the Trump administration, that they are understanding the limits of U.S. power? And wouldn't that then make the world a bit safer? Or do you think that we're in a more dangerous place because then the only option is to escalate to, I don't know, a nuclear level rapidly?
There must be some realization, that of the limits of their power. And we saw that earlier a couple months ago with the announcement that they were going to suspend supplies of certain types of weapons. And the reason for that is that stockpiles were too low. I think it was leaked to a British paper. Maybe it was the Guardian, that like the stockpiles of Patriot interceptors were at like 25% of where they were supposed to be. They'd actually gone way down, below what was considered an acceptable level. And so there, that's a recognition, that's reality, and that's something that they have to be aware of. Now, rhetorically, things haven't changed. The narrative hasn't changed, and we're still, the mightiest military power on the planet, and Russia is nowhere near, is by far our inferior, and so on and so forth. And there's an effort to keep that up. You just wonder how much they really believe in that narrative. It's really hard to say, and how wedded they are to it. Because again, at some point, it's going to be very hard to maintain, and then we'll see what they do.
Do you think most people in the West still believe in that narrative?
You know what? I think they do. That's the thing. I think probably, more and more people in the Pentagon, people whose business it is to know, do see what's going on. And they occasionally leak, their analyses and information to reporters. And occasionally it comes out. Um, but, I was just reading a New York Times story this morning, and it was the same old thing. The Russians basically, the war was a stalemate. The Russians were suffering casualties at twice the rate that the Ukrainians were, and that Putin has been desperate for this meeting, and that Trump finally gave it to him. Which is, I'm sorry, but Putin has never asked for this meeting. That's just false. But that's what the New York Times reported, and that's basically the narrative. And I don't think it really has changed. Again, they reported 2-1 casualties, to the detriment of the Russians. Trump gave it at 8-1. No, it was actually 14-1. He said 8,000 killed among the Ukrainians and well over over 120,000 for the Russians. It was approximately a 14-1 ratio. It just sort of seems, he may very well believe those statistics. And then the Ukrainians themselves recently reported some ratio like 24-1. So, and we seem to get a lot of our information from the Ukrainians. So I don't know. It just seems so obvious to us that Ukraine is losing this war, and it is breaking through. There are more and more articles in the mainstream press on this fact. But the mainstream narrative, that still has not, acknowledged this. There are, the dissenting voices within the mainstream media are becoming louder, but they still haven't really changed, the view of just sort of unchallenged U.S. supremacy.
Yeah. So, I think a big question that a lot of people have is that when when Ukraine loses this war, most people don't imagine things are really going to change that much, or do they? I mean, I think a lot of people aren't aware of the impact of what's going to happen after this war is lost. Is the big impact that myth of U.S. supremacy will be shattered? That we were saying that most people in the West still believe in the narrative that the NATO is the almighty military power in the world, and then after this war, right, that will be shattered. And is that the big deal? What's the big deal? What happens after this? And is that?
Yeah. Well, you know that the propaganda machine will go into overdrive to portray the loss as no big deal. You just think about what's happened in the case of individual battles like Avdiivka, or Bakhmut or whatever. Beforehand, these were strategic cities, and then when they were lost by the Ukrainians, well, they actually wasn't very important, and the Russians suffered huge casualties. It was, in fact, sort of a victory for the Ukrainians. We see this happen time and again, and I'm sure it's going to be attempted on a much larger scale in the case of a Ukrainian loss in this war. They'll do what they can to spin it. They'll exaggerate the number of Russian casualties. Like they've done so far. More than exaggerate it. They'll just greatly inflate the numbers. So they'll describe it as a Pyrrhic victory. For the Russians. But at some point, the reality, just cannot be entirely cloaked. It can be spun somewhat, I think, within the Western world. But especially when the changes on the map become obvious. One thing is that the changes they're still pretty minor. When you look at it, Ukraine's a very big country. Russia is advancing, but it's just, we're talking about very small percentages. And again, there are people who made the calculations that at this current rate, to take the whole country, it would be over 100 years. That actually is pretty true. Now, I don't think they're trying to take the whole country. But it cloaks the reality of increasingly weak Ukrainian forces against increasingly strong Russian forces, and I don't think that that's something that can be hidden because it doesn't appear on the map, and you can just make up figures, like these crazy casualty figures that Trump made up, and that way you can hide it. You can maintain your narrative this way. But at some point, the map is going to change, and it's going to change drastically. We've seen that breakthrough just north of Pokrovsk. The sudden breakthrough, 10 kilometers in a day, and they've expanded from there since. So that is a collapse on a very, on a local level. And I think it's inevitable this is going to occur in more and more places on the line with increasing frequency. And at some point, these gains are not going to be incremental. They're going to be very significant, and they're going to show up in the map. And this whole talk about a stalemate is just not going to be tenable anymore. It's going to have to be admitted that the Russians have won. Again, they'll try to soften the blow, but I think they can only go so far, even with with the skills they have in waging information warfare. So, a lot of people will understand to varying degrees. They'll understand that Ukraine and with it NATO lost the war, and that just has to be a huge blow to American prestige. It's just part of this aura of invincibility will have suffered a very serious setback. And, that has all kinds of consequences. It affects the calculations of all kinds of political leaders, governments around the world, everything from arms purchases to, decisions to go to war or not to go to war. And then in general, it also is just a sign of the decline of the American empire, even, outside of the military. Because, we talk about the three pillars, but they're all interconnected. It's just like if one pillar is weakened, they're all weakened in a sense, because it's all part of the same system. And they see this military weakness. Once you acknowledge the military weakness, it's easier to become aware of economic weakness and the decline in soft power as well. It is a blow to hegemony, period. I don't think it can be otherwise. And again, this is a war. It's not being fought in some sort of, in a far-flung place. It's not, not in Afghanistan, but right here in the heart of Europe. It just can't be hidden or, forgotten the way that other wars have been, even when those wars were clearly failures.
Right. I think that many people will start to come to the conclusion that the United States military industrial complex and just NATO in general is really just a scam. And I think this will be a conclusion reached by people across the spectrum, even if you're a Ukraine supporter or if you're Russia, whatever it is, because they were scammed too. We had this belief that we put in all this money in our military, and just if you look at the numbers, I remember looking at charts as a kid, just man, we are miles ahead of everybody else. Just to look at how fancy our technology is. Are you still there, Dad? You just froze on me.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay,
I'm hearing you fine. Yeah.
Yeah, so, there's just that idea that we're just miles ahead. And then we find out that even though we spend so much of our money goes to our military, it doesn't produce, it doesn't provide. So you'd have to feel like the scam. And I feel like the people that should be the most upset are the people like the Ukrainians, the ones that bought into this, that went full in. And all these other allies, like the Taiwanese, for example, they had a big $2 billion arms package last year. And I just saw that they had some recent shipments of these drones arrive in Taiwan recently, 291 suicide drones. Each one of those drones cost over $1 million, so they paid over $300 million for these drones. It's like, okay, you got 291. I'm sure. How much does it cost for, Russia to produce a drone, or Iran? $20,000, $50,000, and I'm sure it's probably better than what we're producing.
Right.
It's just like
right.
Right.
It's also used up. The 291 would be used up in a single night's raid. It's completely insignificant. It's just a. It's not going to help you win a war.
Right. But I mean, why would someone like Taiwan? They have to understand that. I mean, if they have military analysts, I mean, just somebody that is reasonable. You just look at it. You can never, if you want to fight a war, what we've learned is that you cannot source your products from the West. Because if you're engaged in a real war, they won't be able to keep supplying you. They say, "Sure, we'll get it to you in 10 years from now. Don't worry. It is. Hold on. We'll produce them slowly." It doesn't work. You can't. You just can't do it. So why would you want that to be your source of military hardware equipment if it doesn't work in an actual war? Maybe you could use it for some special ops situations, for small things, but not an actual war.
Right. Yeah. Certainly not a war of attrition. Not for a war that's going to last more than a couple of weeks.
A couple hours.
Like a couple. Just thinking like the Israel-Iran war. It was at the end of those 2 weeks that the Israelis realized, hey, we're running out. Got to stop. So it was.
And they were getting hit the whole time, even if they had them, even if they were able to had the interceptors. It wasn't stopping the strikes from getting through.
It stopped a share. It's really hard to know. It's certainly stopped a good share of them. But I was just reading an article today on the amount of damage that was just done in the city of Haifa, and it was considerable. They're working on it, repairing it, but it was right there in the heart of the city. These buildings that are symbols of Haifa, they got smashed up. It's everybody can see it. But anyway, that's a kind of a separate issue. That's what I was saying, about how the ultimately the loss of NATO, which is really U.S. above all, is going to affect calculations. Again, Ukraine went into this war and they were convinced to fight this war because they were certain of the superiority of Russia, of Western arms. I think they had this deep faith. It's something that it's been an article of faith for many Ukrainians ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, and probably even going back earlier. And they're finding out too late that faith was misplaced. But you just know that there's got to be other governments around the world that are looking at this, and they were thinking, maybe we don't want to do what the Ukrainians did. Now, the Georgians have already made that clear that they're not going to do that. And, unfortunately, we've talked about the Armenians. Right. It just seems crazy, but their leader is just hell-bent on doing it. It just seems like, he's just so certain of the superiority of the West, both economic and military and everything, that he's basically selling off parts of his country. We don't have to go into all the details.
Yeah, but you just wonder what world is he inhabiting? What world is it?
Right. So, there are these, it's just amazing how so many people have this abiding faith in the West. It's something that, maybe formed 20, 30 years ago, maybe like during the 1990s, again, when the U.S. was so powerful and Russia was in along with all the former Soviet republics like Armenia, were in such a terrible state. It wasn't unreasonable at that time to think, no matter what, we got to somehow tie ourselves to the West. And that's our ticket out of this, our ticket to prosperity, our ticket to strength. To have that idea in the 1990s was not irrational. I think probably, again, there were reasons to be careful then. And, I think it was always neutrality would have made more sense back then. But you could see how somebody could make that argument and could believe that. But the world has really changed. It's just that there's always this lag. It's just like people form these beliefs and they become impervious to, the new realities. It takes sometimes a really dramatic incident to shake people out of these beliefs that they have. They've been shaped in the 90s, and then there's going to be something, and maybe that something will be, the defeat of NATO in Ukraine. Maybe that's what will shake people out of that faith. But right now, there are a lot of them who just have it. They just like it. They don't want to hear it. They can't hear it. And the U.S., again, is very good at information war. They provide that narrative and they just seize on it. So it's like, so they can't really see what's happening, but at some point they will see it and we'll see, that may be that the antidote to the 1990s, where finally some people wake up from this and they realize that the world has changed. And that the West isn't necessarily the ticket to prosperity and the solution to all your problems. Right. But actually the solution is to be sovereign and to establish relationships with these different centers of power, that we see in the multipolar world.
Mm-hmm. Can you try not to tap the desk dad because it's picking up pretty hard on the mic?
I'm sorry.
That's
my
fine.
Apologies.
I like that you're animated and getting excited, but it does pick up a bit. Well, what happens then when countries around the world stop purchasing weapons from the United States, from our MIC? Does that just will that destroy the U.S. economy? Like, how important is the MIC to the U.S. economy or the deep state? And if that really just starts to crumble because nobody's buying weapons from them, will that maybe make us safer and the empire? I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, there's certainly going to be an economic impact. I actually don't know what the percentage is, but like military hardware is way up at the top, as far as U.S. exports go. So there is a direct economic impact. But with that, there's also, a political impact because often these military deals, these weapons packages and so forth are tied into long-term relationships. Like a country makes a decision to buy your equipment, it also means they're establishing a relationship with you. It means that you're going to be sending experts and technicians to the country for years, if not decades, and you're going to have these long-term contracts to maintain and supply these systems. So, yeah, there's a direct economic impact. There's also a political impact.
Do you think that what I said earlier, saying that the US MIC and NATO is a scam, do you think that's an accurate statement, that it is essentially a scam? They aren't really designing effective weapons or, practical weapons?
Well, there maybe a scam is a little bit too strong a word, but there's a lot of truth to that. Again, it's not just us, but I know that I think it was actually the German, the Bundeswehr, I guess, the German Defense Department did a study and they admitted that their own weapons were not performing well. And the problems were the kind of problems that we've been pointing out. It's just they're high maintenance, they're fragile. They perform well again at expos. But in real war, real war means, lugging this equipment through off paved roads and maybe off road entirely. It means mud, it means rain and snow. It means, it means, use over the course of not just a day or two, but weeks and months, and constantly taking punishment from enemy fire. Everything from small ammunition to glide bombs. And how well does your equipment work in that? Under those conditions, and how cost effective is it? Because you have to have, maybe you do have a great piece of equipment, but if it costs $10 million and the other side has a piece of equipment that's maybe only 80% as good, but it only costs like 10% of what your piece of equipment costs, who's going to win in the long run? It's just that they have the means to produce a lot more of that 80% equipment. And in the end, they will win. And I think that's what we see. Again, it's just sort of like, we have a lot of good flashy equipment. Maybe again, it's pretty darn good in some cases for 2 week wars against weaker enemies or something. But in a war against a peer adversary or a near peer adversary over the course of months and years, I think we've seen, that that Western equipment really doesn't hold up very well. I think maybe one like the Bradley has done pretty well. I think the Russians have admitted that. That's one. But so many of the other pieces of equipment just haven't. You saw that picture I sent you recently. There was actually a little exhibit in a plaza that we were in Kazan. And there was one board that showed a diagram where there's a picture of an Abrams tank. And it says how to destroy an Abrams tank. And they just pointed to all the vulnerable points on the tank.
So even the kids in Russia know.
Right, done. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe we can move over a little bit to the Middle East, if that's all right. Can you still hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine.
All right, good. Yeah. Okay, so I was just having this thought just about with with Israel, like what can Israel do at this point? Are they even able to stop? Like if you were in charge of Israel, what could you do? I was just thinking like, can they even stop what's happening? Like, because if you did just say, okay, we're pulling out of Gaza, we're done. I mean, like, well, now what happens? What happens to what you've done in Syria and in Lebanon? I mean, in Gaza, the West Bank. You just set the whole region, all of your neighbors on fire. Can you just say walk away and just say, all right, it's done?
Well, they might be able to. I think they can actually, because they do have the upper hand in southern Syria and in Lebanon to a great extent. Yeah, they're in the. I just read today. This was actually an editorial by Haaretz, the left-wing, Jewish Israeli newspaper, that described what's going on in the West Bank as a slow-motion Nakba. They're just taking settlement after settlement, village after village, and the settlers move in after they drive out the Arabs and just take it. Again, we would be talking about the West Bank. That would be a big news story because there's been a huge, rise in these kind of incidents and, a real acceleration in the grab for Arab land there. And they simply have the upper hand in all these places. They have the military might. They have the support of the U.S. So they could stop, but the damage has already been done. I mean, Israel is the most hated country in the world, and that's not going to disappear anytime soon. That's something that's going to last decades. That permanent damage has been done to them. The thing is, with the current government, it's not possible for them to stop. The only way that Netanyahu can retain power is by satisfying his, the extremist element within his coalition. And they will not let him stop, even if he wanted to. And I'm not sure at all that he wants to. But even if he wanted to stop, he just could not. They're not going to let him. They'll pull the plug on his government the instant he tries that. And so he is tied to this war, tied to he's actually drawn up plans for the occupation of Gaza City, where, 1.2 million, that's the majority of the residents of Gaza are living right now. And, it used to be a city. It was the largest city in Gaza, but it had a population of 700,000. But now there are 500,000 refugees within an already very crowded city. Now he's going to take it. I think he's they've called up 100,000 reservists. And the IDF is very reluctant. They said this is going to be a mess. But he essentially, again for his, I think it's two things. I mean, there's his own political survival, but it's clear it's more than that. I think just very recently, he described himself as being on a spiritual mission for a greater Israel. This is, something that he said directly. And I think that's true. I mean, it's just like he sees it's not just a matter of his own survival, or for him, maybe the two things that become one in his mind, his own survival and the creation of greater Israel. And, he, in the end, I don't think he feels that he can walk away from Gaza without at least taking a big chunk of it. And that's probably what part of this operation is all about. He just wants to push all the Gazans into a very small area in southern Gaza and just simply seize the northern part. Now, right now there's actually open talk, within Israel about resettling northern Gaza. There were settlements in Gaza until 2005, and then there were a total of 8,000 Jewish settlers there, and they withdrew. The settlements continue to expand and grow in the West Bank, but the Israelis at that point decided to give up on settling Gaza. But that dream is has been revived, and I think that's what he wants to accomplish. And he can only accomplish it with this operation. It's going to drive the 1.2 million current residents of Gaza City south into an area that's only 25% of the original territory of Gaza. So, this would prior to the war, this was one of the most densely strips of land in the world. And now you can just imagine how densely packed that's going to be. At the same time that he's talking about this operation, he's also talking about third countries receiving the Gazans, but no country has come forward and agreed to do that. I mean, there's mention has been made of Somaliland or South Sudan or probably other countries as well that don't come to mind right now. But he clearly wants to push, those Gazans that he doesn't kill, he wants to relocate to other countries, and he's going
So,
to try to at least carry that out partially. Him.
so he's saying he's calling up 100,000 reservists. So
Correct.
how do you see this going? The siege of Gaza with 100,000 Gaza cities. What are they going to do? They're going to just start shooting at anything that moves, and hope they drive them out. How do you see this going?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that 50 to 70% of the buildings in Gaza City have already been severely damaged or destroyed. So much of the city's been destroyed already. Um, Now the orders will be issued for everybody to leave. And then I think the idea is that anybody remains will just be assumed to be Hamas or something. But the fact is, I mean, that a lot of people are not going to move. Again, it's just like they've received these orders again and again. They're told that there's a safe area. They go to the safe area and then it's bombed. And that's happened again and again and again. So I think it's at this point, there are certainly going to be a lot of families. We don't know how many, but there are going to be thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands that are just not going to move. So I don't, who knows what's going to happen.
Do you think the IDF will be successful in this operation? 100,000 people is a lot of people, but I mean, we're talking about,
Right.
rubble, destroyed buildings. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a tough
Yeah.
operation.
Right. Even if the other side is, just is very poorly armed in comparison to you, it is. It is. I mean, it's easier to defend than to attack. The Gazans, the Hamas has had quite a bit of time to prepare for this. They've been in Gaza City for a while, and yeah, they'll put up a fight. It's going to be costly, and that's why the IDF has resisted. Zamir, I guess, is the chief of staff of the IDF, has resisted Netanyahu's pressure so far, but up until recently, I guess he just had to accept. Okay, the prime minister has the authority to order this, so he's going to do it. But he didn't. He clearly doesn't want to. He's argued that this is just going to be very, very costly for the IDF.
Are the Israelis supportive of this idea?
Generally, no. From my understanding, is that that the majority of Israelis actually would like to see a ceasefire now and have the hostages brought home. That's, um, but again, it's Netanyahu. I guess the political calculations for Netanyahu, are in the end, his survival doesn't depend on these opinion polls. It's holding together this coalition, and this coalition can only be held together if he remains on the offensive in Gaza.
Well, we've seen that in general, the IDF doesn't do great with ground operations. They didn't get very far into southern Lebanon. And they've been killing a lot of civilians in Gaza, but Hamas is still there, and we see these videos of them doing very heroic acts, like running up to a tank and just setting a bomb on it. They've been doing some damage. So I mean, if he goes in and the Israeli society in general doesn't want to have the IDF in there, and it doesn't go well, it starts to become a real slog, and there become more casualties with the IDF. Will that start to break things for Netanyahu and lead
It
to
could, right? I mean, the Israeli society in general and the the political structures are under a lot of strain right now, um, and there's sometimes talk of civil war. I don't know that that's really a possibility, but there are there are severe strains. There's a real polarization that's taking place. Not really so much, not really over the issue of Palestinian suffering. Unfortunately, that's something that really seems to matter to only a very small minority of Jewish Israelis. but just over the issues of, let's say, executive power. That Netanyahu has been centralizing power, in the executive office, under his, and has been gathering it into his own hands, and has been, putting loyalists in different departments, in places like the IDF and other Shin Bet and other agencies that used to be more or less independent. But at the same time, there's quite a bit of resistance and anger about this within Israel. So there is concern for the hostages. I think we're only talking about maybe 25 or 30 live hostages, but that's a constant refrain. And bring the hostage home movement's very strong. And those people seem to understand that the only way to bring them home is actually to make some sort of deal with Hamas. That's when they've gotten hostages back in the past, is when deals were made, and then, with very few exceptions, that's really the only way to get them home. And so there is pressure to do that. And there's a great deal of hatred for Netanyahu, but Netanyahu is a very wily character who's is probably the most successful politician in Israeli history, and he knows how to retain power. And he does have, a strong base of support. I mean, in spite of the anger about the hostages and other things, he's also, it seems like when push comes to shove, he finds a way to stay on top. He's made himself valuable to a lot of people and to a lot of different segments of Israeli society.
Yeah, it seems like every week we see more and more horrific photos and videos coming out of Gaza, and you're just wondering, at what point will there be some type of intervention? At what point will it get so bad that the U.S. is forced to intervene, or countries in the Middle East, somebody does something, Iran starts? Do you see that happening with this invasion in Gaza? You think that the starvation would trigger it, but I mean...
Yeah, no, it's unfortunately, I don't know. I just don't hold out a whole lot of hope. You would hope it would have happened already. It's with these things, yeah, let's see, on the one hand, there is this danger that I think sometimes I see in myself and, other people who are highly critical, that certainly, fully condemn the Israeli actions in Gaza. It's just that you almost become used to it and you become numb to it. It's become a daily reality, and you start to, almost forget about it. And sometimes I have to pinch myself and say, hey, this nightmare is continuing. It's not getting any worse, and it's just unacceptable. And so we do need to condemn it again and again and remind ourselves. But there is that danger that it's just like so much of the world has just become used to it. And it's gone on for a long time without any real moves against him. And you would hope at some point there would be a breaking point, but we just haven't seen it yet. Again, as we've pointed out, there has been more condemnation. There's a symbolic move of recognizing the state of Palestine. There was the announcement by Merz, of all people, that shipments of arms to Israel would be suspended. That's all significant, but it's a long ways. Doesn't seem to be having any effect on Netanyahu and his people. I think maybe it starts to affect some of the more cosmopolitan members of Israeli society, but all in all, it really hasn't changed. You look again at you look at the polls that are taken in Israel, and then, like, on the question of starvation, 80% of Israelis or Jewish Israelis just felt like there wasn't really an issue. There was nothing that concerned them there. The starvation of Palestinians was not a matter of concern to them.
Yeah, it's true. There is a problem that it seems like there's a couple tactics that these players can make. They know that they can just change the news cycle. Some people are screaming at you like this is the most important thing in the world. I think a good point of case is actually the Epstein case. We saw that with Trump, and I was going on like nobody's going to let this go. People are they're going to have to keep onto it. It's starting to just slip out of the news cycle. There's still people that are still on it, but it's just one of those things that no longer is front and center, which was just right there the whole time. And all of a sudden, now they create some other story, get people, and they just know that their attention span's not long enough. They'll forget about it, and then they'll continue. Or with the Gaza war, they realize the other strategy is like, even if it's something that is a longer process or whatever, people will just get numb to it. You just keep on doing it over and over, and people will scream and cry and holler for a long time, but eventually they just get used to it, and they'll be like, this is the way things are, and they'll be like, wasn't it always crazy in that area? They're always fighting. And they'll start to just go into that, slip into that mindset. I mean, the only thing with Gaza, though, is just it just gets even worse. So it becomes harder to look away. It's like, okay, you bombed that hospital in the beginning. That was bad. Kind of forgot about that. You killed all those aid workers, the World Kitchen people, the Red Crescent. Each one of these things just horrible, horrible, and it all becomes distant memory. But then now we see starving kids. It just keeps on coming back. Like, if we need to have some, I'm sure people are documenting this, and there's going to be a movie or something out that we'll see as in just just a lineage of all these just horrible, horrible war crimes committed, and we will look back, as a world, as a civilization, just be like, how did we let this happen? How did we let all of these things go again and again and again and again for years and years, and nobody did anything? It's really it's shameful. It's really shameful, and I don't know. Somebody needs to make that move, and people need to see that, and they need to think about, like, what do we need to, what do we become? And but then, just part of me then also, like, I started the question originally talking about the Middle East, is what can Israel do at this point? I mean, obviously I'm just like, I'm very pro-Palestinian. What Israel's doing is, in my mind, is clearly a genocide. It needs to stop. But then you just say, like, well, what can they do? If you were in charge of Israel, like, you can't. I feel like they can't even stop. Like, that's what I'm kind of. I just don't. I didn't. They're screwed. What do they do? Like, if they stop now, you committed half a genocide. Okay, the whole world hates us. You set all of your neighbors on fire in Syria and Lebanon and in the West Bank. Like, everybody hates you. What can you do now? Like, and I think maybe in their mind, and maybe the problem with the Israelis is that there isn't another option for them, and they've come to accept that. Like, well, I guess. Yeah. This is, this was kind of the plan. I don't like how it's turning out because it's really messy. We're unpopular, but this is the only way forward now. We're in this deep. You can't stop now. They're screwed, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, part of the problem is this victim mentality. It's just like, we Jews are always the victims. And so when the criticism of Israel, grows and grows and becomes more and more widespread, and Israel becomes an international pariah, which is what it is now. You say, see, we're always the victims. We're used to this. And it allows you not to look too closely to what you're doing. Maybe they're criticizing you because of what you're doing, not because you're Jews. But it's easy. You can see this is sort of an easy escape for them. Rather than face the reality, it's just like, oh, it's anti-Semitism. I see that. Again, even Haaretz has some wonderful articles and some great writers, but you see a lot of that kind of mentality there too. I was just, reading a couple of articles that reflected that mentality today. I think that unfortunately, for a lot of Jewish Israelis and their Jewish supporters around the world, it's something that maybe they're not quite happy with, but they already have the kind of the mental framework to accept that and to explain that. So the world hates us. Of course they do. They do. They're all anti-Semites. This is what always happens to the Jews, and they almost, feel like, oh yeah, this is the way things are, and it's almost like the way things are supposed to be. I think many of them think so. They can live with it. They're obviously not all Jewish Israelis are that way, and much less Jews outside of Israel. they can't, and who have actually really turned very strongly against Zionism, or at least, partially against it. But within Israel, and again, in a large fraction of the supporters around the world, this is a very comfortable kind of situation to be in. And it's even, people like Netanyahu are probably quite pleased with it, because they see it potentially as supporting the Zionist project. If you have Jews feeling unsafe or whatever, under attack, you get a certain percentage of them. I think in the end, he actually is miscalculating, because enough Jews, especially, ones with real options, are looking at Israel and saying, maybe this is not such a safe place. This is not such a good bet. But there are certain numbers who are real committed Zionists who just actually, renew their commitment to Israel under these circumstances.
This victim,
and we've seen, apparently we've seen some of that, like after October 7th, a certain number of Israelis came back to Israel, but it went both ways. You're getting a certain type. I think maybe, again, the more cosmopolitan are leaving Israel, but others are actually returning to support the Zionist project.
this victim mentality, is this an identity that was formed after the Holocaust, or was this something that was always part of a Jewish identity?
Yeah, I think it actually it precedes the Holocaust, but of course it was greatly, exacerbated by the Holocaust. No question about it. Right, you can understand it up to a point. But again, we're talking about how the world has changed, like for Europe since the 1990s, and a lot of people just are still living in the 1990s, and they're basing their decisions on the way things were in the 1990s, when we live in a completely new world right now. And the same thing you can say about, Israel and the Jews. It's a completely different world from the world of, let's say, the 1930s. I think you could say, like, what's happened since October 7th has been a wake-up call. There are a certain number of Jews, especially younger Jews in places like the United States, who really have woken up and said, I'm having nothing to do with Zionism. It is something like redefined, and it's broken the spell, and they've entered into acknowledged the new reality. But there are a lot of people that are wedded to the old reality, and they find it, it was where they've always been, and it's where it was part of their identity, and they've actually kind of just renewed their commitment to it.
Yeah. No, the Zionism has really destroyed the fabric of the United States, and I'm fascinated to see what the aftermath is going to be like, especially in this country with Christian Zionism. So much of U.S. identity, a lot of they like to say we're a Christian nation, but it's largely a Zionist Christian nation. And I'm just wondering what that means for us moving forward, and for Christianity in this country, and what's
Right. I don't have answers to the questions, but there's going to be a big impact, because again, these are not Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism has really worked its way into the thinking, the faith of a lot of people in this country, and it's not going to die an easy death, and I don't really know what the consequences are going to be. Just to give you an example, our good friend Lindsey Graham just the other day, I think it was yesterday, said that if we pull the plug on Israel, God will pull the plug on us. It was as a statement of Christian Zionism from our number one hawk.
Right.
But there are a lot of people who actually think that way.
Yeah, I know there are a lot, but a lot of people, I think, are, when they hear these statements, it damages. It's causing a fracture, I think, within the sort of evangelical Christian community. I think there are a lot of people, because they are decent people, and they're just like, wait, something just doesn't feel right about this. I know I was always told that Israel's great, but I don't like what I'm seeing, and I think it's causing a real shift. So, well, anyways, let me go back to just my statement earlier, just saying that Israel is screwed. Do you agree that that's the case? That no matter what they do, even if they just stop now, they're screwed? I mean, if they or they continue with what they're doing, and they're screwed.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's, again, like I said, the damage is permanent. The world's not going to start loving Israel if they just stop right now. The damage is permanent. They're going to be a hated nation for a long, long time. Um, and even if they stop the war, it's just there's no way they're. Even if Netanyahu falls from power in a let's say a more let's say less apocalyptic, less extreme coalition comes to rule Israel, still Israel is by and large committed to it's not by and large, but it's overwhelmingly committed to ethnic cleansing and to this, to Zionism, which is really the expansion of Israel to the greater Israel project. It just might slow down and more attention may be paid to, providing lip service to, you know, you know, to notions of human rights and so on and so forth. But the reality, I don't think it's even possible in this case. But if let's say if we got a new government that was a little bit like the older Israeli governments that, did pursue, supported the expansion of settler control within the West Bank, the, the really, inhumane policies towards Gaza that preceded October 7th, just treating Gaza as an open air concentration camp. If we went back to that government, it's just, I think there's too many people in the world whose eyes have been opened. They were able to fool people in the past because they moved slowly, because they used certain kinds of rhetoric, but I don't think they can do it anymore. I mean, even the old policies were cruel already, and people will see it around the world. And I think that's just not going to change. But I don't think that's even possible, just because Israeli society as a whole, even among so-called, broadly what you might call the left within Israel is supportive, has become radicalized too, does support genocide or ethnic cleansing. And I, so I, things might slow down. At least, for example, he could be thrown out of power, and there could be a coalition government that actually does broker some kind of ceasefire and brings the hostages home and stops military operations for a while. But I think it's only going to be for a while, and at some point it's going to start up again. Maybe it just won't be quite so radical or quite so savage as what we're seeing now. But it's just, again, it's not going to. It's Israel will remain hated, and it will continue down the downward course that it's on now. Again, the younger generations in all these countries that still do support Israel, they're eventually going to come into power, and that's going to be the end. When Israel loses support from the U.S., that's going to be the end of Zionism, because Zionism cannot continue without U.S. support.
Is Netanyahu laying out a vision for his people? I mean, because it sounds like, when we always try to play out the logical conclusion, it's like, yeah, well, this all ends badly for Israel. The vision he's saying is that, yeah, this is just how it is. We're always hated. We're Jewish people. They're going to hate us no matter what. So we just got to do it. And then we'll have our great land, and everybody will hate us. But that's normal. That's the status quo. They're okay with that.
Fine.
Is that his vision?
I think clearly he is. I mean, that's how else can he explain his policies? I mean, he looks to it's not just the U.S. Let's be honest. Of course, the main thing is the U.S. Without the U.S., again, no Zionism. I think it's that clear. But he feels like his support from the U.S. is rock solid, and it is at the moment. But I think, again, if you look at the long-term trends, that support is very much in doubt. But at the moment, probably with, in his lifetime, or at least like over the next few years, it is going to be rock solid. I think that's his calculation, and he's probably right about that.
You froze on me,
but
Dad.
Then, if you look at some of the neighboring countries, like Turkey, or, even the governments of, Jordan and Egypt, and even of Saudi Arabia and so forth, rhetorically.
Hello?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay. even in Saudi Arabia, that rhetorically they can actually be very harsh in their criticisms of Israel. But, behind the scenes, they really don't do anything to oppose Zionism. And leaders like Erdogan work together with him. And, Netanyahu looks at this. He has a government in power in Lebanon, that is compliant. And he has one in Syria that's compliant. He has in Jordan, Egypt, all around him, he's had his way. And so, he knows that a lot of the vast majority of people in these countries hate him and hate Israel. But as far as he's concerned, that doesn't matter, as the governments are on his side.
Hey, Dad, I'm losing you. You're going in and out.
Yeah, I think.
Okay,
I've
Dad,
lost
I think
you.
let's just end it here.
Okay,
If you
can you hear me now?
me.
Okay.
All right.
I'll
Have
talk
a
to you
good
later.
rest of your day.
Okay.
Bye bye.
You too. Bye bye.